Do you find it?
All right, so we're ready to go. All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the sixth and final session of the WSGA Rules Review course for 2020. First, see a lot of red around here. Not sure if that's because it's Valentine's Day or because we're in Wisconsin, or both, but happy Valentine's Day. And second, just want to thank everyone for coming out on a bitterly cold morning. That to have the conference room here at Golf House full on a sub-zero morning to talk about rules 21 through 24, especially, is pretty hardcore. So my head is really off to everyone. So we will finish up. Today we'll cover rules 21 through 24. I'll do 21, 22. Dan will cover 23 and 24, and Bill will go over the review sessions. So with rules, first, just a preface with this, so far the first 20 rules are really written with individual, quote unquote, normal stroke play and match play in mind. Now we're going to shift gears and talk about other forms of play. In 21, we're talking about other types of scoring, really. In 22, 23, and 22 and 23 in particular, different forms of play. In 24, a little bit of a combination with team competitions. So with Rule 21, we'll look at a few definitions to begin with. First of which is maximum score, which is a new format for 2019. That is, maximum score is a form of stroke play where players or side scores capped at a maximum number of strokes set by the committee. So the committee could say it's 2 times par, or a fixed number like say 7 or 8, or net double bogey. And net double bogey is certainly a term we're all become familiar with the new world handicapping system for this year. And it's a nice form of play, and that with the first or the majority of Rule 21 is going to talk about the 3 forms of play in stroke play: maximum, Stableford, maximum score, and par and bogey competitions. And they're all great formats because they allow a large number of people to compete against each other in stroke play, but also don't require a player to hole out on every single hole. If you have a bad hole, you can just pick up, and depending on the form of play, if it's maximum score, you have the maximum score put down, and you continue. So it helps with pace of play. Second definition, another form of play is par bogey. Is again, it's a form of stroke play, but the scoring is done as in match play. That say in a par competition, it's as if you're playing against an imaginary opponent who's very steady and pars every single hole. So if you par a hole, you tie the hole. If you birdie a hole, you win it. If you bogey a hole, you lose the hole. And then the competition is won by the side with the highest total of holes won versus holes lost. And what's interesting with par bogey competition is that the winner, say if it's on a tough course or if it's in difficult weather conditions, the winner could be the one who's 4 down after 18 holes. So even though that person lost, perhaps handedly, to Mr. Parr, he or she did better than everyone else in the field and still would be the winner. Next, Stableford. It's a form of stroke play where the score for the hole determines how many points awarded for that hole against a fixed score set by the committee. So it's up to the committee to determine what the fixed score is. As we'll see, the default fixed score is par, unless the committee says otherwise, and the competition is won by the player or side who completes the rounds with the most points. And then our last definition for Rule 21 is 3-ball, which is also the last form of play covered in that rule. In this, we're going to shift gears, and it's a form of match play. We have 3 players, and each is playing an individual match against the other 2 players at the same time. So, for example, if Bill, Dan, and I are playing a 3-ball match, I'm playing a match against Bill, playing a separate match against Dan. Dan's playing a match against Bill. So we each have two separate matches going on. So it's, in this day and age where efficiency and use of time is so important, it's very, it's very efficient because you're playing one round of golf, but you're playing two matches. So it's a good use of time. So now we'll talk about Rule 21, and we'll go through those four different forms of play. And with 21.1, where or the first three sections, we'll talk about the forms of stroke play: Stableford, maximum score, and par bogey. And we'll see that those three forms of play are very similar. They're not quite identical, but you see a lot of similarities in provisions within each one. So first, with Stableford, 21.1, in first point to keep in mind is that it is a form of stroke play. So stroke play rules do apply. This repeats the definition. Then we talk about how the rules for stroke play do apply. You could have a Stableford competition, be it scratch or on a handicap basis, could be an individual, or it could be a partnership basis, such as foursome or four ball. Scoring, we talked about how Stableford is based on points, and points are awarded to a player for each hole by comparing the score to the fixed target score, which is set by the committee, and the default fixed target score is par, but the committee could change that. For example, if it's a competition for beginning golfers and the committee doesn't want to get into handicaps, the committee could say the target score is bogey or double bogey and adjust the points accordingly. So here is the, on the next page, 177, the table for point allocation. So in the basic gross individual Stableford competition with par is the fixed score. If you make a par, for example, you earn 2 points. If you make an eagle, you earn 4 points. You make a bogey, you have earned 1 point. And then here's the genius of it, is that if you make a double bogey or worse, you earn 0 points. So that means if it's a par 5 or a par 4, you are already like 5, you might as well pick up because you're not going to earn any points. And that allows for a good pace of play, as well as salvaging one's pride. As we say, see under the table, player does not hole out, simply gets 0 points. If you don't hole out, that's the same as making a double bogey. And furthermore, we've talked about how the new rules really emphasize pace of play. You say to help pace of play, players are encouraged to stop playing when their score will result in 0 points. So with Stableford, since it's a form of stroke play, we know that there has to be a scorecard, but how is the scorecard filled out? Well, we'll see that if the hole is completed by holing out and that score would result in points being awarded, then the scorecard is going to have to show the score for that hole. So if it's a par 4 and the player makes a 4, then there needs to be a 4 for that hole. But if the player did hole out, but that score would result in 0 points, such as making a 6 on a par 4, then the scorecard must show either no score or any score that results in 0 points being awarded. So let's say it's a par 4, I make a 6 on the hole. So what are the options? What needs to go in the box? Either no score or some score of 6 or higher. So even if I put 9 down, or let's say, take another example where I'm really stubborn, I make a 9 on the hole, but my marker just puts me down for a 6. Is that okay? Answer is yes, because bottom line, I get 0 points, and what that number is doesn't matter as long as it results in 0 points. And it's going to be the same if I never hole out. If I don't hole out, either no score or a score that results in no points being awarded. Now, at the end, the committee is the one that's responsible for calculating how many points the player gets on each hole, and in a handicap competition for applying the handicap strokes to the score. So, as a committee, I would, you'd certainly think that just about the biggest headache a committee would have for a form of play would be perhaps a net 4-ball Stableford competition, because the committee has to apply a lot in that case, has to apply handicaps, has to determine the points for each hole, has to determine the 4-ball score for each hole. So that's a lot for the committee to do. On the next page, we see a illustration of a scorecard emphasizing what's the committee's responsibility and what's the player's responsibility. The player just needs to make sure that the hole-by-hole scores are there and are accurate, and then the committee, it's then up to the committee to apply the points. For example, this player birdied the first hole, so it's up to the committee to say, okay, this player earned 3 points on the first hole, and so forth. All right, so how do we apply penalties in Stableford? Well, penalty strokes are usually just added to the score as they are during a normal stroke play round. But there are 3 exceptions. That is, if the player breaches Rule 4.1b, for example, the player started with more than 14 clubs, then the committee is going to deduct 2 points if this breach existed for just 1 hole, or 4 points if the breach was for 2 or more holes, from the player's total points for the round. And we'll use this, since this is more likely to happen than exceptions 2 and 3, we'll just walk through this for a minute to make sure we understand what all that means. So let's say, for example, I start the round par, and then I realize I started the round with too many clubs. So for those 2 holes, ordinarily, how many points would I earn? I'd earn 4 points, 2 for each of those holes. But now, what's the committee going to do? Subtract 4 points. So, but the committee does that at the end of the round. So really, I am going to be penalized. But what happens if, say, I'd started the round 6-6, double bogey? Then ordinarily, I would earn 0 points for those 2 holes. But now the committee is going to deduct 4 points, so I'm still going to be penalized. So and that's the key theme with these 3 exceptions, is these ensure that regardless of how poorly the player may have played the hole or holes in question, the player is still going to be penalized. So exception 1 deals with too many clubs. Exception 2 deals with starting either early or late within 5 minutes of the starting time. So that means, for example, if I show up 1 minute late to my starting time, then I double bogey the first hole, I'm still going to be penalized for starting late. And then similarly with unreasonable delay. But then what's important with this is on top of page 179, an important requirement for players, that for each of these 3 situations, the player must report the facts about the breach to the committee before returning the scorecard. Because why? Because this is not something that's reflected in the hole-by-hole scores for that round. Rather, since this involves the deduction of points, and the committee can only deduct those points if it's made aware of it, the player is therefore required to inform the committee, and if the player doesn't do so, then the player is disqualified. And speaking of disqualification penalties, next section, a player breaches any of these 4 rules, the 4 following rules, is not disqualified, but gets 0 points for the hole where the breach occurs. So what are these? These are ones where a player is ordinarily required to correct a mistake in stroke play or be disqualified, such as if the player has failed to hole out, if the player plays from outside the team area, if the player plays a wrong ball, or if the player commits a serious breach of playing from the wrong place. If the player does that, and the player does not correct the mistake, instead of being disqualified, the player simply earns 0 points for that hole, which is a good and sensible result. Is, for example, imagine you're playing a par 4, you get up to the green, and you realize that you have played a wrong ball. Ordinarily, you certainly have the right with 2 penalty strokes to go back and correct that mistake, but realistically, 90+% of the time, what's going to be your score if you go back and do that? It's usually going to be double bogey or worse, resulting in 0 points. So that means, so it's a pragmatic approach, saying that the player at the green can say, geez, I'm probably not going to do better in double bogey, so I'll just pick up and go on to the next hole. And that's fine. He's not going to be disqualified. Next section, 21.1D. Oh, but then the final, we shouldn't overlook the final sentence of that section. If the player breaches any other rule with a penalty of disqualification, then the player is going to be disqualified. So, for example, in the third hole, if a player makes a stroke with a non-conforming club, the player is going to be disqualified. 21.1D, very specific exception. We'll see repeated in the next couple of sections. Rule 11.2, which talks about the deliberate deflection of a ball in motion, does not apply in this situation. And it's a specific set of facts. If a ball in motion needs to be holed to get 1 point, so for example, it's a par 4 and I am putting for a 5. So the ball needs to go in order for me to get 1 point. If it doesn't go in, I get 0 points. And any person, so it could be me, could be a caddy, could be another player, any person deliberately deflects or stops the ball at a time when there is no, emphasis on no, reasonable chance it can be holed, there's no penalty to that person, and the player gets 0 points. So the common application is par 4, I'm putting for a 5. The ball's racing past the hole, and it's not going to go up a slope and come back towards it, and Phil knocks the ball back to me. Then in that case, no penalty to Phil, no penalty to me. I just get 0 points for that hole. Exactly, exactly, Jim. Very basically the same as the match play rule. If I'd been putting to tie Phil and I missed, and Phil knocks it back to me, there's no penalty to Phil. All right, when the round ends in Stableford, when the player holes out on the final hole, or the player chooses not to hole out on that hole, or already has reached the point where the player cannot earn any points. So that is Stableford. Again, a great form of play. We certainly have a number of Stableford competitions here, which are a great form of play, whether for serious competition or for recreation, for outings and so forth. It's a great form of play. It takes the edge off things because people aren't concerned that in the round they have to turn in that they shot 93, because nobody fully appreciates, for example, in this country, if 28 points is good or bad. There's really no shame with that, for example, and it's very popular. And then, some parts of the world, like Australia, it's the predominant form of play at the club level. So now we'll shift gears, talk about a similar but slightly different form of play called maximum score, which was introduced in 2019. We talked about the definition where the committee will set what the maximum score is for the hole. It could be 2 times par, so that on a par 3, that the worst possible score you can have for that hole is a 6. Could be a fixed number, such as an 8 for any hole, regardless of par, or it could be a net double bogey. Maximum score can be at scratch, or a handicap, individual, or a partnership. Scoring. So the players score for holes based on the number of strokes taken, including penalty strokes, except the player will get only the maximum score, even if the actual score exceeds that maximum. So again, this format allows players to pick up when they have a bad hole, and it helps protect players' pride. That that if, say, the worst you can do, the maximum score is 2 times par, and you record a 6 for a par 3 when likely you would have made 9 or 10. That's not a bad thing, and it might prevent some beginning golfers from getting discouraged and posting a embarrassingly high score. So it's a helpful form of play. Player who does not hole out gets the maximum score for the hole, so similar to Stableford. And likewise, to help pace of play, players are encouraged to stop playing when they've already reached the maximum. Now, how to fill out the scorecard. To meet the requirements of the scorecard rule, if the hole is completed by holing out and the score is lower than the maximum, then the scorecard must show the actual score. And if the score is same or higher than the maximum, then the score just as in Stableford, must either show no score or any score at or above the maximum. And same if a player doesn't hole out, either no score for that hole or any score at or above the maximum. So if it's a par 4 and the maximum is 2 times par, and a player doesn't hole out, either no score or any score of 8 or higher. And then this is important, that it's the committee's responsibility for adjusting the player's score to the maximum for each hole. So, for example, if it's a par 4 and with a maximum of score 8, and say my marker writes down 9 for me, it's the committee's responsibility to correct that and change, and well, not to correct it, but to put me down for an 8 with an 8 for that hole rather than a 9. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? Is it wrong for a committee to ask players, if they don't hole out, to write an X in the box so that the committee knows that they didn't hole out? Or does this rule supersede
Is
that?
it wrong for a committee to ask a player who doesn't pull out to write an X? I don't think, strictly speaking, that's right, in that this rule says the player could write, for example, 14 or some other number. But I think if the committee wants to ask players, in a non-binding way to help them with scoring and say, if you think about it, please, as a marker, please don't write down a score higher than the maximum just to help us out. They could, but the committee couldn't impose a penalty, though, for failing to do that. Oh, okay. All right. Penalties and maximum score, very similar to what we saw with Stableford. Penalties, strokes normally apply just as they do in regular stroke play. But in these 4 rules, if the player gets the disqualification penalty, the player's not disqualified, but rather just gets the maximum score for that hole. So the example we use with Stableford, with the player who plays a wrong ball and does not correct the mistake, that player is just going to get the maximum score for that hole. But if the player breaches any other rule with a penalty of disqualification, then the player would be disqualified.
But it doesn't have the exception of the 2 strokes or 2 points versus the 4, like you did in the other.
That's exactly right, and that's and you're very bright, you're very observant to have picked up on that, because that's one difference, perhaps the biggest difference between maximum score and Stableford and par bogey. Is in Stableford and par bogey, we have those 3 exceptions. For example, carrying too many clubs, where the end result is adjusted to ensure that the player is penalized, and that does not exist in maximum score. So, for example, let's go over an example of that. Let's say maximum score format is 2 times par. First hole's a par 4. The first 2 holes are par 4s, and I get off to a bad start. I get off to an 8-8 start, and then I realize I have too many clubs. So what will the committee do? What's the penalty? Well, in this case, since there's nothing telling me to do otherwise, I'm going to apply the penalty strokes to the first 2 holes, with the net result being that what? I'm not going to be penalized, because already I wasn't going to earn any points on those holes, or not earn any points, but I'd already reached the maximum score of 8 for each hole, so my score for each hole remains 8. So it is an interesting little twist there, that with maximum score, you do not have those exceptions.
Do you think that was by design or an oversight?
My sense is that it was by design. My impression is that maximum score is intended to be a welcoming, player-friendly format especially for new golfers, perhaps, and just to try to keep it within the spirit of that, keep it like that. And you could, it does raise the question of whether those exceptions and those other rules make sense or should be there. Because in some ways it does seem a little harsh for the rules to go out of their way to say, hey, no matter what, we want to make sure you are penalized. Then let's see, 21.2D, exception to 11.2, just as we saw with Stableford, or very similar to that. If a player's ball in motion needs to be holed to score one lower than the maximum score. So on a par 4, I'm putting for a 7. The ball rolls past the hole. Bill knocks it back to me. There's not going to be a penalty to either of us, and my score for the hole will be 8, the maximum score. The round ends when the player holes out on the final hole, or chooses not to, or has already reached the maximum score for that hole. Par and bogey, repeat of the definition. And one point to keep in mind, the more common form of play with this is par. For example, where you're playing against, someone who pars every single hole. And what bogey means is bogey is a more of a traditional relaxed form of par. You really don't see it that much, but every now and then, especially overseas, on a scorecard, you might see a column for par, you might see a column for bogey. And that, for example, a course might be a par 72, but it might be a bogey 76. That, for example, that 450-yard par 4 might be considered a bogey 5. That 230-yard par 3 might be considered a bogey 4. So it's just a slightly relaxed form of par. And as we talked about, it's a form of stroke play. So you need, but scoring is done as in match play. Can be scratch or handicap, can be individual or partnership. If how holes are won and lost, well, if the score is lower than the fixed score, the player wins the hole. So if it's a par 4, it's a par competition, and I birdie it, I win the hole. If I par the hole's tied, and if I bogey the hole, then I lose the hole. And again, part of the appeal of this, just as we saw with maximum score in Stableford, is player with a bad hole can just pick up. Is a player who does not hole out loses the hole. So if it's a par 4, if you make a 5 or you simply pick up, it's the same. You lose the hole either way, just as in regular match play. Now for scoring, it's going to be similar to what we saw before. If the score the player made would result in the hole being won or tied, then the scorecard must show that score. If the score results in the hole being lost, then scorecard must either have no score or any score that results in a lost hole. If the hole is not holed out, then same, either no score or any score that results in a lost hole. The committee is responsible for deciding whether the player won, lost, or tied each hole, and in the handicap competition, applying the handicaps as well. Note the exception if the player returns a scorecard with the hole score lower than the actual score, but this does not affect whether the hole was won, lost, or tied, there is no penalty. So for example, let's say it's a par 4 and I make a 6, but I return a score of 5 for that hole. Ordinarily in stroke play, that would be a disqualification. But since either way, 5 or 6, I lost the hole, there is no penalty in this case because of the form of play. Now with other penalties, penalty strokes are added as they normally are, but there are these 3 exceptions we've seen regarding clubs, time of starting, and unreasonable delay. And we'll look at exception 1 again. Player has too many clubs. If it's a 1-hole breach, for example, he realizes that in the first fairway, the committee will deduct 1 hole, or if it occurs, or if players in breach for more than 1 hole, 2 holes. So just as would be done with regular match play scoring. So and again, this is to ensure that the player is penalized. So if I start off bogey, bogey, and then I realize I have too many clubs, well, at that moment I was 2 down. Now I'm going to be 2 worse off. So now, even though that deduction really is applied at the end of the round, I'm going to wind up, in theory, being 4 down after 2 holes, just as if I'd been playing a match against Dan and I'd lost the first 2 holes against him and then realized I had too many clubs. And as we saw with Stableford, when each of those 3 situations, the player must report the facts of the breach to the committee before returning the scorecard, because it's the committee's job to deduct the hole or holes from the total. And if the player does not report to the committee, the player is disqualified. Disqualification penalties. We've seen these 4 rules again, 4 situations that in regular stroke play would result in disqualification, but if a player reaches that point in a par or bogey competition, instead of being disqualified, the player simply loses the hole. So a result that's similar to what we saw in Stableford in maximum score. But any other disqualification penalty would result in disqualification. Exception to Rule 11.2, as we saw with the other 2 forms of play, this will be familiar. If a player's ball in motion needs to be holed to tie the hole, and any person deliberately deflects or stops the ball when there's no reasonable chance it can be holed, no penalty, and the player loses the hole. So par 4, I'm putting for a 4. Bill stops my ball as it's rolling past the hole. No penalty to Bill, no penalty to me, and I get the result of the hole, which would be a loss of hole. So that's par, bogey, and Stableford and maximum score. Before we shift gears and talk about 3-ball match play, any questions on those 3 forms of play? Yeah.
Just to be clear, in max score, if I have achieved an 8 and the 14 club rule is broken, it is not a 10, it's an 8.
Correct. The question is with maximum score, if I'm, and let's say the maximum score for first hole is 8, and during play of the first hole, I realize I have 15 clubs, and I go on and make an 8 on the hole, and then what's my ultimate score for that hole, and that is that it's 8. Because if you add the 2 penalty strokes, I'm still going to get the maximum score. That those 3 exceptions we see in Stableford and par bogey do not exist in maximum score. All right, so now Rule 21.4 and 3-ball match play. So now we're talking about match play with each of 3 players playing an individual match against the other 2 players at the same time. Each player is playing 1 ball. It's used in both of his or her matches. Normal rules for match play apply, except that you have a couple of specific rules that apply to situations where applying the normal rules might conflict with applying them in the other match. And one point to keep in mind that these really emphasize is, let's say that Phil, Dan, and I are playing a 3-ball match, that with respect to my match with Dan, what is Phil? Phil's an outside influence in regard to the match I have with Dan, and that's and where possible, you try to separate that, and that's what these next sections talk about. So first, we'll talk about playing out of turn, which we know is a special situation in match play. If a player plays out of turn in either of the 2 matches, the opponent who should have played first may cancel the stroke. But if the player played out of turn in both matches, then each opponent may choose whether to cancel the stroke in his or her match with the player. If the stroke is canceled in only one match, then the player must continue with the original ball in the other match, which means that the player must complete the hole by playing a separate ball in each match. So, for example, so let's go through an example of that. Well, first one question: how many people here have played a 3-ball match? And it's not a goofy form of play or anything. In fact, and it makes a lot of sense, but it's interesting how infrequently we tend to play it. So what does all that mean? So let's say Phil, Dan, and I are playing a 3-ball match, and we get to the 4th hole, and I should be playing last from the teeing area. But instead, for some reason, I rush up there and tee off first. So I've played out of turn both in my match against Dan and in my match against Phil. So, and let's say I hit the tee shot into the left rough, not into the fescue, but in the moon rough. And Dan says, well, that's probably about as good as John can do. I don't think he can do that well again. And I say, Dan, thanks for the vote of confidence. And Dan says, John, I want you to replay that stroke. And then Phil says, you know what? I'm already 4 up on John. Don't need to rub salt in the wound. John, you can just go ahead and play that ball. Continue with that. So what does that mean? That means in my match against Phil, I'm going to play that ball from the rough, finish out the hole. And that's going to be my score for that match. My match against Dan, I'm going to replay from the teen area in the correct order. And then that'll be my score. So I would be playing 2 balls, but the important thing is, though, I'm only playing 1 ball in each match. So it's, we're kind of splitting hairs because, people say, oh, you can't play 2 balls in match play. And as, Dan went over, you can't play 2 balls in match play if you're unsure what to do. But in some cases, you could be playing 2 balls, but I think it helps to look at it from the perspective that you're only playing 1 ball per match.
Now the question is, how did you get poured out on the 4th ball?
Oh, I forgot. I gave a whole number. Well, I tied too many clubs. There is a bad morning. All right, so with that in mind, let's look at the next section, 21.4C. If an opponent gets 1 penalty stroke for lifting a player's ball or ball marker or causing the ball or ball marker to move, that penalty applies only in the match with that player. Now remember, under Rule 9, we went through some situations where there is no penalty for moving your opponent's ball, such as if you lift it from the putting green in the belief it's your own ball, or while helping a player search for it. But otherwise, say if you're just walking down the fairway and you accidentally kick and move your opponent's ball, you're normally penalized. So let's say I do that with Dan's ball. So what would happen in my match against Dan? I incur 1 penalty stroke. So what happens in my match against Phil? Well, in my match against Phil, what's Dan's status? Outside influence. So therefore, in my match against Phil, my moving Dan's ball has no relevance. So in my match against Phil, there's not going to be a penalty. So what does that mean? That means that for that hole, I'm going to wind up with 2 different scores. Might have a 5 in my match against Dan and a 4 with my match against Phil. And that's okay, because again, remember, you just need to remember that each match is separate, even though you're playing together in the same group. And that's a 3-ball match play. So just those 2 little wrinkles. Otherwise, it's just a normal match play. Then in interesting section 21.5, something a lot of people thought you might never see, and that is the word scrambles and greensums appear in the rules of golf. And I think that's just an acknowledgement that these are, very popular forms of play. They're played millions of times each year, and acknowledgement that the rules can have some issues fitting in, and it's really up to the committee in charge to lay down the rules for those competitions. And in the big book, in the committee procedures section, it talks about that with some suggestions on how to go about doing so. Yeah. Greensome, I believe, is
it is a variation of foursomes where both partners play from the teeing area, and one of the 2 tee shots is selected.
So
Everybody tees off.
Yeah, so you and I would both tee off, and then we pick one of our tee shots, and then from there we alternate into the hole.
It's
shamble.
Yeah.
That's exactly how
Yeah.
one of your tournaments is run, is it? Father-daughter?
Yeah.
And
We don't
here,
call
well, I sometimes you hear that format called like the Pinehurst
Yeah.
format or
Yeah.
Chapman.
Or seniors, or Chinese.
All right. So now we'll move on to Rule 22, talking about, and that was a good question and a good segue, talking about foursomes. And notice that the rules we all say, go ahead and say, also known as alternate shot. So let's look at 3 definitions that go along with this rule. First is foursomes. form of play where two partners compete as a side by playing one ball, alternating order on each hole. Could be match play, could be stroke play. Partner is a player who competes together with another player as a side. Could be match play, could be stroke play. And then, as we mentioned, side, let's look at that as well. Side is two or more partners competing as a single unit in match play or stroke play. They could be playing their own ball, as in four ball, or one ball, as in foursome. And then a helpful final paragraph with that definition. Just a reminder that a side is not the same as a team. In a team competition, each team consists of players competing as individuals or as sides. And Dan will get into that more in Rule 24, and that's especially important in, say, most commonly high school and college golf, to remember that those teammates, even if they're playing together, are not side, they are not partners, which means, for example, they may not exchange advice. Let's see. Rule 22, overview, we talked about. The final paragraph just also mentions threesomes, which is similar, except where you have two partners playing one ball alternately, playing against one player who's playing his or her own ball. Rule 22.2, either partner may act for the side. So this involves some changes for 2019 and simplifies matters. And that is, since both players compete as one side, playing only one ball, either partner may take any action allowed for the side before the stroke is made, such as marking the spot of the ball, lifting it, replacing, dropping, placing, no matter which partner's turn it is to play. And that is a change. So, for example, let's say Dan and I are partners, and it's my turn to play, and I hook the tee shot into a penalty area. This means that either one of us can go up and drop a ball before the next stroke, even though Dan, we know that, or we'll see that Dan is the one who's going to make the next stroke, but either one of us may drop a ball. Next item, a partner and his or her caddy may help the other partner in any way that the other partner's caddy is allowed to help, such as to give and be asked for advice and take the other actions allowed in Rule 10, but must not give any help that the other partner's caddy is not allowed to give under the rules, such as, I can't ask Dan's caddy to hold an umbrella over my head while I putt. That, my caddy can't do that, so therefore Dan or Dan's caddy may not do that. Any action taken or breach of the rules by either partner or caddy applies to the side. And then the last bit there is important. In stroke play, only one of the partners needs to certify the scores, i.e., in most cases, sign the scorecard. So if Bill and I are partners, just one of us needs to sign the scorecard when we return it. Now, let's talk about some of the more specifics of this form of play. On each hole, the players must make each stroke for the side in alternating order, which means one partner is going to play first from the team area on the odd-numbered holes, while the other partner will play first on the even-numbered holes. And that can be one of the fun aspects of foursomes play, is the strategy that let's say if Bill and I are partners and we say, Bill, you're the better iron player and 3 of the 4 par 3s are even numbered holes, so why don't you tee off on the even numbered holes? There are going to be strategy like that. Or, well, all the par 5s are on the odd number holes, so have the longer hitter play off the tee there. There can be some interesting strategy with that. After the side's first stroke, the partners must alternate strokes for the rest of the hole. So if I tee off and Bill's my partner, then Bill is going to make the next stroke. And then we'll see that penalty strokes do not affect the order. So if I tee off and I hit that tee shot out of bounds, then Bill is going to make the next stroke from the teen area, even though that next stroke will be our third for the hole. If a stroke, in the rare cases where a stroke is canceled or otherwise does not count, the same partner who made the stroke must make the next stroke for the side. So for example, in foursome match play, if Bill and I, we play on the correct holes. So let's say I'm teeing off on the odd numbered holes and I do tee off number 7, but I tee off when it was really our opponent's turn to tee off. Then if our opponents require us to cancel and replay, that I would still be the one to play that tee shot. And if the side decides to play a provisional ball, it must be played by the partner whose turn is to make the next stroke. So for example, if in the fairway I play and I hit the ball into some bushes and we decide we should play a provisional ball, then Bill would play the provisional ball. Which makes sense, because what would happen if we went up there, searched for the ball, we couldn't find it, and we had to return another stroke in distance? Who would make the next stroke? Bill would. So it makes sense then that Bill would be the one to play the provisional ball. So the penalty for making a stroke in the wrong order in breach of this rule. So wrong order does not mean with respect to the opponents, but with respect to your partner. That is going to be the general penalty. So if that happens in match play, for example, I'm supposed to tee off on the odd numbered holes, but I accidentally tee off number 4, then match play, Bill and I are going to lose that hole. If it happens in stroke play, it's the general penalty of 2 strokes. But then in your book, you almost want to put an asterisk or draw an arrow next to the part that follows. Just because in stroke play, there's more to the story than that. In that in stroke play, the side must correct the mistake, which means that the right partner must make a stroke from where the side made the first stroke in the wrong order, and the stroke made in the wrong order, and any strokes before the mistake is corrected do not count. And if the side does not correct the mistake before starting another hole, the side is going to be disqualified. So what does that mean? So let's say in the example where I am playing from the odd numbered tees and I tee off number 4. Then we've played in foursome stroke play. Then we've played in the wrong order. So we're going to incur 2 penalty strokes on hole number 4. And Bill must then correct that mistake by playing from the teen area on hole number 4. And if we don't correct that mistake, for example, if we think, oh, we'll just add 2 penalty strokes and then we'll finish out the hole, then we're going to be disqualified.
So, but all the strokes you've taken up to that point don't count.
That's right. So for example, that tee shot I played on number 4 will not count, but there would be 2 penalty strokes. Rule 22.4, starting the round. The side may choose which partner will play from the first teen area and starting the round, unless the terms of the competition mandate that. And sometimes, and it could just be for simplicity and pace of play purposes, let's say in a mixed foursome event, to avoid situations where, let's say a player is playing from the forward tee and has to play first before a player has to play from the back tee. To avoid that, the potential delays in that, the committee might say in the terms that males play on the odd numbered holes, females tee off on the even numbered holes, and that's okay. It takes away some of the fun and strategy of foursomes play, but for kind of pace of play and traffic reasons and frankly safety reasons, that might be the simplest approach in some cases. The sides round starts when that partner makes a stroke to start the first hole. And how do we apply the starting time rule? Because one of the great and really interesting points about foursome play is that, especially if you have a course whose format, whose layout allows for it, and then the players are conscious of that, is that in theory, a foursome match should take less time than an individual match. Because what happens, let's say that Phil and Dan are playing against Bill and me, and that Dan and I are teeing off on the first hole, ideally, Bill and Phil would already walk out to the landing area and be positioned there, and which means that they will likely have played the approach shots before Dan and I even reach the landing area. So it really can be a quick form of play. And what's interesting about that is it means that if played properly in that way, that you wind up spending more time with your corresponding opponent than you do with your partner. Because normally, you just see your partner at the putting green. So how do we apply the starting time rule? Well, the partner who's playing first on the first hole must be ready to play at the starting time and starting point and start at that time. And the partner who's to play second must be present at the starting time, either at the starting point or on the hole near where the ball played from the teeing area is expected to come to rest. So if Bill is out in the landing area of the first hole at our 9 o'clock starting time, that's fine. That he's fulfilled the requirement of this rule. If he is, say, still in the parking lot or still in the locker room or on the practice area, then that would not be okay. Partners may share clubs, and that is permissible, but with a big restriction is that they may share clubs only if between the two of them they have no more than 14. So if Bill and I are partners, and you rarely have a case where, say, I pick out my favorite 7, Bill picks out his favorite 7, and we share. Really, it's more likely to happen, say, if Bill's clubs were delayed by the airline and he simply doesn't have any clubs and he just plays out of my bag. That is okay. But the key is that neither one of us can have access to more than 14 clubs during the round. All right, so that is Rule 22 in foursomes play. Any questions on that?
We don't have a question on that, but we did have a question on the maximum score, which is interesting.
Okay.
It comes from Michigan, and in their state high school girls tournament, they set a maximum score of 12. And if a player, after getting to her 12th stroke, continues play of a hole, could a committee penalize that player for undue delay?
Okay.
And if you did that, wouldn't it be in the code of conduct?
Oh, all right. That's a good question. If the committee has in a maximum score competition, or question is, in a maximum score competition, may a committee penalize a player for continuing to play beyond the maximum score for unreasonable delay? And I think that's something that just with the rules themselves would really need to be extreme. I mean, it's possible, but I think that's probably better handled through code of conduct, which committees now have the authority to do. So, all right, anything else on 22? If not, we might as well go ahead and continue straight with 23 with Dan.
Thanks for your supper. All right, let's move on to Rule 23. There's really only one definition, and it's 4-ball, so we don't need to go over that because we're going to go over it in the very first part here. 4-ball is one of the most common, if not the most common, form of play when you have 4 people as buddies that go out and play. A and B are buddies, C and D, and they play each other. You play 4-ball, you pick the best one, and on you go. So let's look at 4-ball. Rule 23 covers 4-ball, which is either in match play or stroke play, where the partners compete as a side, with each side playing a separate ball. The side's score for the hole is the lower score. We know that. All right, 23.1, overview of 4-ball. 4-ball is a form of play, either match or stroke play, involving partners where 2 partners compete as a side, with each player playing his or her own ball, and a side score for a hole is the lower score of the 2 partners on the hole. Rules 1 through 20, which John pointed out are designed for singles play, will apply in four-ball as modified by these specific rules. And note that really should say rules 1 through 21. Why? Because in four-ball, you can have scoring based on Stableford. You can have it based on maximum score. You could have a four-ball Stableford scoring, so Rule 21 would be applicable. A variation of this form of match play, known as best ball, where an individual player completes against a side of 2 or 3 partners, and each partner plays his or her own ball as modified by these specific rules. Do we still inaccurately call our four ball the best ball, Bill?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
All right.
Doing
Yeah.
parentheses because we don't know what it would be.
All right, but technically best ball would be an example of if, say, John is the better player, and then he says, well, I'll take on you and Bill and Jim, then that's best ball. John counts his, and then the other 3, we pick the best ball of the 3 of us. That's technically what best ball is. All right, 23.2, scoring in four ball. Side score for hole in match play and stroke play. When both partners hole out or otherwise complete the hole under the rules, the lower score is the side score. Makes sense. When only one partner holes out or otherwise completes the hole, that partner's score counts. When neither partner holes out or otherwise completes the hole, the side does not have a score for the hole, which means in match play, the side loses, and stroke play, the side is going to be disqualified. Why? Because they don't have a score for the hole. But understand that third bullet point says, or otherwise completes the hole under the rules. You have to bear in mind that this could be a Stableford scoring. So in theory, you could have, quote, no score for a hole in Stableford. You're not going to be disqualified. You would simply get no score for that Stableford in the Stableford scoring. All right, 23.2b, sides scorecard in stroke play. Remember, this is stroke play. You can play four ball match play, but four ball stroke play, you have to have a scorecard. And you have to comply with Rule 3.3, which we've gone over previously. The side's gross score for each hole must be entered on a single scorecard. In a handicap competition, each partner's handicap must be entered on the scorecard. So for each hole, and this is basically out of Rule 3.3b, the gross score of at least one partner must be entered. There is no penalty if you enter more than one. Each score on the scorecard must be clearly identified as the score of the individual partner. It's not enough to identify as a score as simply the side score. So if we look at diagram 23.2b, and we'll see that Kate and John are playing in a four ball stroke play competition. So on the first hole, Kate gets a 4, John gets a 5. They each put their scores down. The second hole, it looks like Kate, for some reason, did not finish the hole. Maybe she couldn't get better than a 3. Maybe John chipped one in and she said she's going to move on. But whatever, she simply picked up and has no score. So the committee will score John's because that's the only one that is there. Go to the third hole, they each score the same. The committee has the ability to choose either one of those because the scores are the same. What you can't do, and sometimes you see this, is say on the second hole, the marker, instead of putting the 3 in the box by John's name, it puts the 3 sort of halfway between Kate and John in that box. In that case, the side's going to be disqualified. Why? Because the score is not identifiable to a particular player. You just have a 3. You don't know whether Kate got the 3 or John got the 3. What the scorecard rules in four ball say is that you have to identify it to the particular player who actually got that score. Committee's responsibility. The committee is responsible for deciding which score counts on the side in each hole, including applying any handicaps. If only one score is entered for the hole, that score counts. If the score of both partners are entered for a hole, the first double arrow. If the scores are different, the lowest score counts. If both scores are the same, the committee may count either. If the score is used is found to be wrong for any reason, the committee will count the other score. So let's go through a couple of examples of that. Look at the scorecard on 191. First hole, Kate gets a 4, John gets a 5. They go into the scoring tent, they turn in their scorecard, and now it has developed that what Kate did on the first hole was she ground her club in the bunker, knew she ground her club in the bunker, and didn't take the penalty strokes. So the question then is, have they come under the scorecard exception to 3.3b? And the answer is no. Why? Because Kate knew that she had incurred the penalty and she didn't add it to her score. So what we would have in that situation is Kate having a 4 on a scorecard, which is the score to count. And the side is going to be disqualified because Kate really had a 6 and she said she had a 4. So she put down a score lower than she earned and the side is disqualified. Let's go to the third hole. Kate and John each get a 5. Kate on the third hole takes a practice swing in a bunker, does not know that that's a breach of the rules. She turns in her scorecard, and then it comes to light that Kate had touched the sand in the bunker. She's questioned, and they say, "Did you know that?" And she's, "No, I didn't know that was a penalty. If I'd known that, I would have taken it down." In this situation, Kate's score then for the hole is changed to a 7. But since the 5 and they both had 5s, the committee then can count the other score. So they would then count John's score. And that is the purpose of double arrow under section 2. The second double arrow. If both scores are the same, the committee may count either score. If the score is found to be wrong for any reason, and in this case it was found to be wrong because Kate had turned in, had not entered the appropriate score, the committee will count the other one. Here is the oddball out on this. I think this is an editorial comment. This is not a very good rule, but it is clearly the rule and it is clearly intended this way. And it's under interpretation 23.2b parent 2. And if you look at the 9th hole, you'll see that Kate had a 6 and John had a 5. So what score are you going to count? You're going to count John's. Now it turns out they go into the scoring tent, they turn in their scorecard, and it turns out that John really had a 7. Why did he have a 7? Because he ground his club in a bunker, did not know it was a penalty. And then the committee then is going to say, okay, under 3.3b, we're going to add 2 penalty strokes to yours, so you get a 7. And then you would say, well, isn't Kate's 6 a better score than 7's? And the answer is, unfortunately not, because we have to count John's score of a 7. Why is that? Because if you look under 23.2b2, it says if the scores are different, the lowest gross or net score counts for the whole. And the interpretation, which is 23.2b parent 2, says in that situation, we're going to force the player to take what is effectively the higher score, because that score is the one that is, quote, lower when the scorecard is turned in.
So the differential is because the scorecard's been turned in?
Yes.
That's what
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And notice, if they haven't turned in the scorecard, you don't have any score that matters yet, because you don't, it's only when you turn in the scorecard that what is on the scorecard becomes final. All right, 23.2c. This is, John's gone over this at least twice, and he probably went over it once when we talked under Rule 11.2. I think of this as the Jordan Speith rule because about 2 or 3 years ago, I think it was a Ryder Cup format. Somebody putted, the ball went past the hole, it was still moving. Jordan Speith then stopped the ball and hit it back. That was a penalty because he deliberately touched a ball that was still in motion. This rule was then put in to override that or change that result. And again, the key is the stroke must be such that it's not going to affect the outcome of the hole. And once you do that, if you're putting for a 4 and you miss it, your side already has a 4. It doesn't make any difference what you're going to get then. So then anyone can pick up the ball or knock it back. All right, 23.3. When round starts, ends, when hole is completed. Interestingly enough, under the old rules, there was no provision, at least I don't think there was. Maybe there was something in the decision that told you when the round started. So now we have an explicit rule that makes a stroke start. So what's the significance of that? Assume it's a 4-ball match and you have A and B on the first teeing area, assuming it's the first hole. Side A strikes the ball right into the middle of the fairway. The round is now started, even though B has not made a stroke. What's the significance of that? Well, now B says, well, I think I'm going to swap out my driver for an extra 3-wood. He's now violated the 14 club rule because he is now during the round, and therefore he's now playing effectively under 15 clubs. When round ends, a side's round ends in match play when either side has won the match, or in stroke play when the side completes the final hole, either by both players holding out or by one partner holding out on the final hole and the other player choosing not to do so. And then 23.3c, when hole is complete, the match play is the same. Stroke play, a side has completed a hole when one of the partners has holed out and the other partner has either holed out or chooses not to do so, and I would add, or cannot better the side's score. And the reason that becomes important is if you are putting for a 5 and the side already has a 4, that hole has been completed, even if you, quote, choose to putt out. And again, that becomes significant for questions of can you practice between holes and so forth. 23.4, one or both partners may represent the side. The side may be represented by one partner during all or any part of a round. It is not necessary for both partners to be present, or if present, for both to play on each hole. So you can have a 4-ball match, and I've had the unfortunate situation of playing a 4-ball match and having a partner not show up. And so I simply played all 18 holes. Actually, we didn't get to 18. I lost before 18. But one partner can play all of the holes, and the other one does not need to be there for any of those holes. If a partner is absent and then arrives to play, the partner may start play for the side only between the play of 2 holes, which means, and you have an odd result here because the difference between match play and stroke play. And in match play, it's before any player plays, and in stroke play, it's before your other partner starts. Why the difference? The way to think of this is a match, a 4-ball match, you have 4 players that are involved in that match. So the minute that one player plays, that match has started on that hole. If you have 4-ball stroke play, the other, quote, twosome that you're playing with is not part of your match. There isn't a match. You're playing just 4-ball stroke play, and that other side is treated like any other side on the course. So the key is when you or your partner start the hole is when the side has started. An arriving partner who is not allowed to play on a hole may still give advice or help to the other partner and take other actions for the other partner on that hole. Interesting point here is that the penalty for violating this rule is a general penalty. So you and your partner are supposed to tee off on hole number 1. You tee off and your partner is not there. Does the other partner, and then he arrives 8 minutes late, does the other partner get a penalty for not starting on time? And the answer is no, because a side can be represented by any partner. But what this says is that other partner can't join that player until they play the second hole. But the penalty is a general penalty. So in stroke play, if partner A tees off, hits 3 out of bounds, and now he's in the middle of the fairway, lying 7, or hitting a 7th shot, and then partner B shows up and says, gee, how you doing, partner A? I said, well, geez, I'm not doing so good. Partner B could go back, tee off. He gets his 4 for the hole. He's going to get a 2-stroke penalty. He's going to get 6 strokes, which is presumably better than his partner can do. So that's the operation of 23.4. 23.5, players' actions affecting partners' play. Player allowed to take any action concerning partner's ball that partner may take. And of course, the exception is right in the first line, each person's got to play their own ball. Although each player on a side must play his or her own ball, a player may take any action concerning the partner's ball that the partner is allowed to take, which means they can lift it, they can mark it, they can place it, they can drop it. And you could even have a situation where the other partner decides for the first partner that his ball is unplayable, and he picks it up and he says, Charlie, you're going to take an unplayable ball. Why? Because that is any action concerning the partner's ball, and the player and the partner can do that interchangeably. So it's a very broad definition of what you can do with the partner's ball. The one thing you can't do is you can't make a stroke at your partner's ball. The second bullet point, and John touched on this under foursomes, a player and the player's caddy may help the partner in any way that the partner's caddy is allowed to help, but must not give any help that the partner's caddy is not allowed to give under the rules. So the way I think of these two bullet points is the first one says you can take any actions concerning the partner's ball. The second bullet point is really dealing with the Rule 10 situations. You can give advice, but as John points out, you can't do the other things in Rule 10 that your own caddy could not do, such as holding an umbrella over your head. You also get into the same issues under 2B4 with the caddy standing behind them. The player can't stand behind the partner can't stand behind if the player's caddy couldn't stand behind. All right, and then the top of 193, in stroke play, partners must not agree with each other to leave a ball in place on the putting green to help either of them or any other player. And notice that's only stroke play. So if you're playing a 4-ball match play, A and B can say, Charlie, leave it there. But as we talked about when we went over Rule 15.3, the other side has the absolute right to say, no, you got to mark it. But it's only in stroke play where if you agree to leave it there, you're going to get the either disqualification if you know you're not permitted to do it, or a 2-stroke penalty if you don't know you're not permitted to do it. All right, 23.5b. Partner is responsible for players' actions. Any action taken by the player concerning the partner's ball or equipment is treated as having been taken by the partner. These bullet points are fairly helpful to describe what we're trying to get at here. And the way to think of this is you go through these bullet points. You improve the conditions affecting the stroke to be made by the partner. We're then going to give the penalty to the player's ball that was involved. So if I am the player and my partner's ball is in a bunker, and I go in there and I improve the conditions affecting the stroke for purposes of helping my partner, I took the action, but I don't get the penalty. My partner gets the penalty. Similarly, accidentally causing the partner's ball to move. So I'm walking down the fairway, I accidentally kick my partner's ball. The penalty is on the partner, not on me, the person who took the action. Third bullet point. Fail to mark the spot of the partner's ball before lifting it. So the ball is on the putting green, and I think I'm going to do my partner a favor, so I go over and pick up his ball and clean it, and I forget to mark it. Again, I took the action, but the penalty is going to be on the partner. So the way to think of 23.5b is it treats the action of the player as if it were the action of the partner, and then it gives the appropriate penalty to the partner for the action taken by the player. In that last sentence, if actions of the player or the player's caddy affect the play of both the player's own ball and the partner's ball, see 23.8a2 to find out if there's a penalty for both sides. We're going to go over that in a minute, but what this is getting at is if you improve the conditions affecting the stroke in a bunker and it affects both you and your partner's ball, we're going to see when we get to 23.8 that both player and the partner are going to get the penalty. All right, 23.6. Sides order of play. Partners may play in the order the side considers best. This often comes up in four ball, and it sort of goes like this: A and B versus C and D. A has a 30-foot putt, B, his partner, has a 3-foot putt, and C and D are somewhere in the middle. What that means is it's sides A, B's turn to play, and if they determine that they want B to play first, even though he has a 3-foot putt, they can do that. Or they can have A play first, but it is the side that gets to decide if one of their players has the order of play. Either player on the side can play. And here we have the exception: continuing play of hole after a stroke conceded in match play. A player must not continue play of a hole after the player's next stroke has been conceded if this would help his or her partner. If the player does so, his or her score for the hole stands without penalty, but the partner's score for the hole cannot count for the side. So take the situation where it's AB versus CD, and A is 30 feet from the hole, and his partner B is 3 feet. And AB say, B, why don't you putt first? You're putting for a 6, but that's going to help me see the line of play, so you go ahead. Then CD says, no, we concede that next stroke. What this is saying is you've now conceded that next stroke, so player B then gets his 6. And he's not going to be able to undo that. That's what he gets. If he then putts, effectively the penalty is then going to be on A. A's next score for the hole cannot count. So they have to then count the 6. 23.7, this is the same rule in foursomes as in four ball. Partners may share clubs, and as John pointed out, the key to understand this is that the total clubs cannot exceed 14. There is always a question on the national exam that goes something like this. Partner A has 13 clubs and partner B has 13 clubs. And when they get to the such and such a hole, partner A wants to use partner B's driver. Is that permittable? Is that permitted? and they want you to fall into the trap of saying, oh, then you'd only have 14 clubs. No, they have collectively 26 clubs between them. So you can't share clubs unless the total number of both players is 14 or less. 23.8, a very interesting rule. When penalty applies to one partner only or applies to both partners. So what we're going to look at is when one of the partners gets a penalty, what are we going to do? Is it just the partner or is it both people that get it? And it's broken down into 23.8A, which is penalties other than disqualifications, and 23.8B, which is disqualification penalties. So let's look at 23.8A, penalties other than disqualifications. Penalty normally applies only to the player, not the partner. When a player gets a penalty other than disqualification, that penalty normally applies only to the player and not also to his or her partner, except in situations covered by 2, which is what we're going to talk about in a minute. Any penalty strokes are added only to the player's score. And in match play, a player who gets the general penalty has no score that counts for that side, but the penalty has no effect on the partner. So the obviously examples, if it's A and B, A is walking down, he kicks his own ball, obviously he gets a penalty stroke, that doesn't affect the partner. You hit a ball out of bounds, you're going to get a penalty stroke, you have to play from where the previous stroke, your partner doesn't get any penalty. That's the normal rule. Let's look at the 3 exceptions. This is parent 2. 3 situations where player's partner also applies to the partner. And as we've talked about, anytime you see the 14 club rule, a red flag should go up because this is one that's different than all the other ones. So when a player breaches the 14 club rule in match play, the side gets the penalty, and in stroke play, the partner also gets the same penalty. You may ask why they single out the 14 club rule, and the answer is because it's an adjustment penalty. Under the old rules, there were probably 3 or 4 different rules that had an adjustment penalty. Under the new rules, we only have one, and it's 4.1B. And if you think of it in match play, you're going along, you win the first 2 holes, A and B win the first 2 holes, you're standing on the 3rd teeing area, and you discover that partner A has 15 clubs. Well, you have an adjustment penalty. So before you started 3rd hole, A and B were 2 up. What is the adjustment penalty? Does that mean that you then go and lose both A and B and so now you're 2 down? No, it's an adjustment penalty. You adjust it down by 2 holes. So instead of being 2 up, you are 0 up or even. You just take the 2 off. And the reason is an adjustment penalty, there's no way to assign that penalty to only one partner. You are effectively assigning it to the side. That's why it is here. In stroke play, you're also going to get the same penalty to both partners. So if A and B each had a 4 on the first 2 holes, they now go to the 3rd teeing area and they discover that they have one of the partners has 15 clubs. Each of those partners is going to have his score adjusted such that each of them has a 6 on the first 2 holes because they each get 2 penalty strokes even though only one of the partners breached the 14 club rule. And the way to remember that is it's an adjustment penalty, and that's the only way to ensure that you actually are given the penalty that you have rightly or wrongly incurred. The last 2 bullet points, the situations in which a penalty by one is going to be applied to the other, when the player's breach helps partners play. So an example of that is you hit your ball out of bounds. You say, I'm not going to hit another one. So you kind of walk up there and your partner is 150 yards from the hole. And you say, oh, I'll just drop one here and hit an 8-iron and show you how it goes. Well, the partner that hit is probably considered to have practiced on the course because he didn't play from where he's supposed to, and his actions helped his partner. So both partners then are going to get the penalty. Third bullet point, in match play, when players breach hurts opponent's play, again, this is only match play. The way to think of this is when you give the wrong information. So A and B are playing CD, and all 4 balls are right up, say it's a par 5, the balls are right up by the putting green, and C and D look at A and B and they say, okay, well, what are you two lying there? And they both say we're lying 3. CD now makes a stroke in reliance upon that representation, and then A says, oh, wait a minute, no, I'm lying 4. What this says is in match play, when the player's breach hurts the opponent's play, the partner also gets the same penalty. So in that case, they're both going to get the same penalty, which in match play, if you give the wrong number of strokes taken, is loss of hole. So you pick up and you go to the next hole. There is an interpretation that says this only applies if the player who gives the wrong information is, quote, in contention in the hole. Meaning, if you get up to the putting green, the 4 balls are lying there. CD says to A, B, what are you guys lying? And A says, I'm lying 7. And they then play, and then A says, oh no, wait a minute. I'm actually lying 8. I forgot to talk about this one. This provision would not apply because A was not in contention for the hole.
So even if it's just a normal mistake, like you somehow spaced it, it's not like you do it intentionally. So intention doesn't matter, it's still a penalty.
Yeah, the question is, in the examples I gave, A and B and playing C and D, and you're on the putting green, and you are asked, what do you lie? And if you say you lie 3 when in fact you lie 4, it makes no difference why you said 3 rather than 4. It wasn't because you spaced out or whatever it was. You are required to give the right number of strokes, and if you don't do it, it's a loss of hole in match play. All right, there's a big exception on the top of Rule 23. Player who makes stroke at wrong ball is not treated as having helped partners play or hurt opponents play. Only the player, not the partner, gets the general penalty, and this is true whether the ball played as a wrong ball belongs to the partner, an opponent, or anyone else. This gives me my chance to talk about my David Stabler story. David Stabler is one of the top rules guys in the WSGA, the one who puts together the test. And I was at a seminar about 5 years ago. David Stabler was going over this, and under the old rules, it wasn't quite as explicit as the rules now. You had to find a decision that made this point. So after David Stabler then made his presentation, he says, you know, this is the rule. And since people keep missing this on the test, I'm going to put this on every test I do until the day I die. Well, people still miss it. David Stabler is still alive. He still works for the USGA, and he still puts together the USGA tests. So I can tell you that almost 100% certainty, this question will be on the national exam. And it goes like this. You're on the putting green, you're 10 feet from the hole, and you put the ball down and you putt it, and it turns out that you played the wrong ball because it was your partner's ball. You're disqualified because you've played a wrong ball. Didn't that stroke that you make help your partner? Of course it did. Now they know exactly how the ball is going to break. This exception says the other partner does not get the penalty. It's just that simple. So this is an exception, even though it has helped. And again, it's a good chance that that may be on the national exam. I'm not sure what,
Can't count. Correct.
yeah,
Correct.
if it's,
The person who played the wrong ball.
So even though he showed his partner the line,
yes,
his partner can still putt that ball.
absolutely. And that's the whole purpose of this exception. And you say, well, this isn't right. Well, it's the exception. Now, notice that I said that he played the wrong ball, meaning he did it accidentally. If you do it deliberately, then there's a whole different scenario there because you really aren't playing a wrong ball. You're practicing on the course. Your practice has shown the partner what to do and blah, 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 and you're both going to be disqualified. Or, the score won't count. All right, 23.8B. This is the second part of this, and this is disqualification penalties. A side is disqualified if either player gets a penalty of disqualification under any of these rules. And then you see this long laundry list of 15 different rules. The question you may ask yourself is, how am I going to remember them? Do they have anything in common? What's the technique to remember those? Because when we turn the page, we're going to see there are some rules in which you don't get disqualified if you have those. I've heard the WSGA talk about these 15 as, quote, egregious acts. If that helps you remember these 15, so be it. That doesn't help me at all because I don't understand why if you turn in a wrong scorecard, that's an egregious act. It may be not a good act, but not an egregious one. So here's the way I remember these 15 rules, and I divide them into 3 categories. The first is you are violating or breaching rules that go to the spirit of the game, and there are 2 of those. We'll go over those. The second category is the potential advantage that you gain is too great to be considered a valid score. And the third category is that you've breached one of the fundamental player responsibilities in the game of golf. And there are 8 of those. So let's go back and talk about the first one. And that is, the first 2 is the spirit of the game violation. So under Rule 1.2, standards of conduct, partner A gets disqualified for not complying with standards of conduct. Well, what does that mean? It's got to be a serious breach of conduct. Example, he throws a club, it injures somebody, he engages in an abusive activity, which could be not only repeated language abuse or, again, throwing clubs repeatedly. If he's disqualified, what they're saying is, your side's done. We're not going to let the other guy. Why? Because that is such a violation of the spirit of the game. The second part of that is Rule 1.3, and that's playing by the rules. And again, the way to think of that is you're disqualified because you haven't played by the rules. Basically, you're cheating. You know very well that you got a 6 on the hole, but you're put on your scorecard a 5. Or you and your partner agree that you won't count this. You're effectively cheating. So both partners are going to be disqualified, even if only one partner was initially disqualified. The next 5 rules involve the potential advantage is too great for a valid score. And that's 4.1A, 4.1C, 4.2A, 4.3, and then skip down a couple, 6.2B. All 5 of those deal with using equipment, and you're therefore disqualified for improper equipment, either non-conforming clubs, non-conforming balls, or on the teeing area, non-conforming tees. And the way to think of that is, if you use a non-conforming club, how do you know what's the justifiable penalty? Should it just be 1 stroke? I mean, what kind of advantage do you get if you use hyped up balls or if you use equipment? And so with these 5, the potential advantage is too great to have a valid score. So if a partner has non-conforming clubs or balls or tees, not only is he disqualified, but the side is disqualified. And then the last 8 on that list, starting with unreasonable delay. And again, remember, this is not a one-stroke penalty for unreasonable delay. This is a partner getting disqualification for unreasonable delay. So that means there's been some issues when that partner gets disqualified. And then the rest of them on the list are basically under Rule 3, which deals with scorecard violations, handicap, and 5, practicing on the course. I lump these together, these 8, as a breach of fundamental player responsibilities. You cannot run a golf tournament if players don't turn in their scorecards. That's a fundamental responsibility, and if you don't do it, the side's gone. We don't want to deal with those people. Let's go to sub 2. When breached by both partners means the side is disqualified. So what we're saying here is, if one partner breaches this, that's not enough. You have to have both partners breaching this in order to have a disqualification. So you take the first one, which is the starting and ending round. Partner A shows up on time. Partner B's nowhere to be seen. Well, we know under 23.4 that a partner can represent the side all they want. So you don't need the other partner to be there. It's only if neither one shows up and 5 minutes have passed that you're going to have a disqualification. And then in the stroke play situations, those are the 4 must corrects. If you're playing stroke play, if you don't hole out, you're disqualified. If you play the wrong ball, you're disqualified. What we're saying in 4-ball is, if you do one of those 4, you're not going to have a score that counts for that hole, but you are not disqualified. You just don't have a score for that hole. But if both partners do something on the same hole that causes them not to have a score, obviously they don't have a score and they have to be disqualified. So as an example is on the first hole, if partner A fails to hole out and partner B hits a wrong ball, and they then tee off on the second hole, neither one of them has a valid score for the first hole. They're both, the side is disqualified. The parent 3 is when breached by one player means only that the player has no valid score for the hole. The opening 4 words say, in all other situations. It's not crystal clear what that means, but I think that means in all situations other than the 15 listed under parent 1 and the 7 listed under parent 2. So what that introductory phrase is saying is, other than the 22 situations that we've just talked about, where a player breaches a rule with a penalty of disqualification, the player is not disqualified, but his or her score on the hole where the breach happened cannot count for the side. So you may say to yourself, what could that possibly be? So it's a free cup of coffee for anyone who can identify a rule that is not one of the 22 where the player can be disqualified, which means only that his score doesn't count. Anyone know one? John, you probably do, but okay.
Did you ask a question to which you don't know the answer?
He's a lawyer. Of course he didn't. Of course he didn't.
Lawyers never ask.
I wrote it down, John, just in case I was going to forget. The answer is, the only thing that I know of that is not on that list of 22 are the failure to report rules. An example is, think of playing 2 balls under 20.1C3. So you're on the 10th hole, you're not sure of whether your ball is or is not in ground under repair, so you then decide to play 2 balls. You score the same with both balls. What this is saying is, this is one of those rules where, and 21.1C requires you to report to the committee, and if you don't report to the committee, you are disqualified. What this is saying is, in that situation, we are not going to disqualify you from the whole competition. We're simply going to say your score on that hole cannot count. So you play 2 balls on the 10th hole, you score 4 with both balls, you write down a 4, your partner writes down a 3. What's the score for the hole? 3. Is there any ramifications for you having written down a 4? No. Are you disqualified? No. That's what that's saying. Take this situation. You play 2 balls, you score 4 with both balls, you don't report, your partner has a 5, so you write down a 4, and then you turn in your scorecard. In that situation, the side's disqualified. Why? Because it's a scorecard violation. You said you had a 4 when you didn't have a 4. Why? Because you were disqualified from that hole. Your score can't count. So that's what parent 3 is talking about. All right. Any questions on Rule 23?
And this never happens in WSGA events because of Bill's lengthy instructions to 4-ball participants. But I've seen in other events where we're talking about keeping the scores on the scorecard, where you'll have a player making a 4 on a hole and his partner's putting for 3. He hits it up 2 inches from the hole and picks it up. The opposing team, the markers, are putting 4 down for both players. And they may even circle the person who actually did hole out.
The real 4, huh?
The real 4. But at some point, if that circled 4 is then, the committee eliminates that 4, they're looking at the other 4 on the card and giving a 4 to that team, and thereby making that team subject to disqualification. And it is very popular in other events that I see. And I guess the question is it very important to say, even for handicap purposes, the reason that team is putting that other 4 down, they don't want to see that person getting a handicap advantage in the future.
Let me see if I can kind of repeat this for the people online. In 4-ball, you often have a partner who gets a legitimate 4, and his other partner who is putting putts and misses his 3 and has a 3-incher, and instead of putting it in, he simply picks up. So partner B effectively has no score. He has no score. Partner A has a 4. So they write on the scorecard 4 for partner A, and then for partner B, they write down a 4 for handicap purposes, because they want to make sure that partner B is not going to turn in a 6 and so forth. In terms of the scorecard, there is one score that counts for 4, and that is legitimate. So there is not a scorecard error there. However, if player A subsequently had his score changed in some fashion, then the other person's score would then be an incorrect score, because he didn't in fact have a score, he had no score. So I guess for handicap purposes, and maybe this is addressed to Bill, in that situation, do you want the other player to write a 4, or would you prefer that the other player leave it blank?
It's the precise reason. This is why I asked John the question. Why, if a player does not hole out, we ask them to write an X, which signifies to us that that player on that side failed to hole out. Or in a singles competition, that player failed. We're talking 4-ball now.
Right.
But in your specific example, Randy, if the 3-inch putt that was, quote unquote, given for handicap purposes, if that has an X in it and a 4, I know that that player did not hole out. if for some reason the other score is not a 4 and it's something higher, it's the only score that can count on the whole. And then we go to that player's score to determine whether the side's disqualified or not.
So what Bill's saying is it really is very helpful to the committee to put an X and then a 4 rather than just a 4, because that the committee has to know what the low score for the side is. And then again, if the other player is disqualified for some reason, if you just saw a 4 on there, you would revert to 4, and that team would then get something that to which it is not entitled. It didn't have a 4 in the hole.
It's amazing how many times you'll make that 3-inch putt too.
Well, it's critical for the committee
No
to
doubt.
know that tapped in putt is.
Was tapped in.
Because we put in handicap scores for these players.
That's part of the problem of kind of intersecting the handicap part of it with the rules side of it.
And that happened in one of our tournaments where we were told to X out if we didn't hole out. And then when the scores got recorded, they automatically put the max on all those holes that were X'd out.
Right.
And that caused.
Yeah, and frankly, in a competition, you know, that's why many committees or associations won't post scores in a match play scenario or a 4-ball scenario, is because you don't know what the player's likely score on the hole was. And so you're posting a fictitious score. So why do it at all? Let the player post his own score.
USGA rules require a player to post that score, and if he doesn't hole out, he is required to determine the likely outcome, which in the example that we're giving is a 4, not, as Jeannie is saying, the person gets a 6 because that's the max they can get.
Right, but then that's also convoluting the handicap rules with the rules of golf, and it's a dangerous thing.
All
But
right.
if you write an X, I know you didn't hole out. What I put down after that is immaterial. I know you didn't hole out. Your score cannot count for that hole.
All right. The problem obviously was Randy's question. You should not have brought up that question. He's disqualified from this hole. All right. Let's talk about 24. Assume you want to go on. Do 24, yeah. 24 is team competition. It's only a couple of pages. Under the old rules, there really wasn't a section on team competition. Now we have a separate rule on team competitions. And again, a team is different than a side. A team means, and I think of it as a high school or a college event, or it could be the Ryder Cup, where you have 2 teams where everybody on one side is playing against the other people on the other side. Rule 24, it covers teams competition played in either match or stroke play where multiple players or sides compete as a team with the result of their rounds or matches combined to produce an overall team score. A team is a group of players who play as individuals or as sides to compete against other teams, and their play in team event may also be part of another competition, such as an individual stroke play that takes place at the same time. So it would be fairly typical in a high school event, for instance, at the state tournament. You have sort of 2 separate competitions. You have the individual stroke play for the player, and you have the individual stroke play for the team. And a player can win one and not the other. The NCAA has a situation in which you play, for their finals, you play 4 rounds of stroke play, which determines the individual stroke player, and it selects the top 8 teams that then play in match play for the last 2 days. So you really have, in one competition, because it's set up this way, a match play, and a stroke play. The committee decides the form of play, how a team's overall score is to be calculated, and other terms of the competition, such as in match play, the number of points awarded for winning or a tie, and whether the tie ends in a tie or whether you're required to play off. And again, in the NCAAs, you have 5 players, and so they want you to play off. They don't want 2.5, 2.5. You got to have a team that has the wins. In stroke play, you may have the committee can decide how many scores count, and typically you would have 5 players and 4 would count. But there's no, that's the way most high schools and colleges do it, but there's no reason why you couldn't have 6 players and 5 count, or 5 players and 3 count, or even 5 players and the best counts. Each team may name a team captain to lead the team and make decisions for it, such as which players on the team will play in which rounds. Think of the Ryder Cup. You have a team captain. He is not a player. He's just a team captain. Although, as the rule says, the team captain may be a player in the qualification, in the competition. There is an interpretation that talks about what happens in a stroke play event that is to be played over multiple days. Again, take the high school event. And on the first day, 5 players play, 4 scores count. One of the players gets disqualified. Is that player disqualified only from the first round, and therefore he or she can play in the second round, or is it disqualification in the first round, meaning they're out of the tournament? And the answer is it means that the player is only disqualified for the round on which they are disqualified. And then there's a caveat in that interpretation, and it's 24.2/1, that if the disqualification is for something egregious, such as a serious misconduct, the committee has the authority to disqualify the person for both days. So if on the first day, the player takes his club and whacks his partner or his opponent over the head with a 5-iron, and the person is bleeding, and they say, okay, you're disqualified, they can disqualify him from the second day for using the 7-iron in an improper manner. All right, 24.4. Advice allowed in team competition. Person allowed to give advice to team is an advice giver. And again, the easiest way to think of this is the coach in the high school event. The coach is never a player. He is the, quote, advice giver. And then if you look at the first line under 24.4a, it says the committee may adopt a local rule allowing each team to name one person. Skip down 10 lines where it has blue, and you'll see the committee may adopt a local rule allowing a team to name 2 advice givers. Rather bizarre rule structure there. I'm not sure why it's set up this way, but I think if you piece the 2 together, you come to the conclusion that if you have a local rule, you can name 2. The second thing that the conclusion I come to is if you don't have any local rule, the advice giver can't give any advice. Because it says the committee may adopt a local rule. If you don't adopt a local rule, then I don't see how the advice giver can give advice. So that committee then should adopt a local rule. And in that they should say, is it 1 or 2? Typically in the high school event, they allow 2, and strangely enough, they allow 2 even if you have a single player. And so you'll have 2 advice givers for 1 single player in a state tournament.
So vice captains in the Ryder Cup format, there's the most they can have are 2 advice givers.
Yeah, but I think in the Ryder Cup they only allow 1 advice giver.
Okay.
I don't think they allow the vice captains to give advice. Coach Purdy, in an ironic twist, yesterday Dan discovered that the WIAA does not adopt a local rule which will be fixed by Monday.
So we never did adopt the local rule. Decided to go to.
Coaches have always been giving advice contrary to what the rules allow.
Well, with two exceptions, at
The
the
state
boys'
tournament.
state tournament and the girls' state tournament, we adopted a local rule allowing two advice givers. All right. Bullet point number 1, the advice giver may be the team captain, a team coach, or other person. The advice giver must be identified to the committee ahead of time, and the committee may allow a team advice giver to change during the round. So generally what they do in the high school and college, the coach has some sort of lanyard that identifies them as the coach or the assistant coach, and they have a little dot or something that allows them to have the ability to give advice. Also, when you adopt the local rule, usually it is I think it's H5, perhaps it's H2. H2, it's the one that says, and the committee has the authority, I think it's H2, has the authority to limit where the advice giver can stand. And usually there's provision that says the advice giver, which means the coach, cannot go on the putting green and cannot go into a bunker.
Can I switch an advice giver for a hole and then give it back to the original advice giver?
The question is, can you switch advice givers for a hole, presumably for some strategic reason, and then switch back? If you did that for purposes of a caddy, you couldn't do it if the only reason you're switching caddies is to get advice. However, the whole purpose of an advice giver is to give advice. My reaction would be, yes, you can, provided you comply with the requirements under H2, which says you have to identify it, and if you do change, you have to tell them. All right, restrictions on advice giver while playing. If a team's advice giver is a player on the team, he or she is not allowed to act in that role while playing around. And then while playing around, the advice giver is treated like any other playing team member for purposes of the restrictions on advice. So let's talk about the situation of a coach standing behind a player, a coach meaning an advice giver. And is this rule the same as John went over under 10.2b4, such that anytime the coach is standing behind the player deliberately, the player is going to get a penalty? And the answer to that is no. They are treated slightly differently. There is an interpretation on advice givers. I'm sorry, it's a clarification on this vote. Under Rule 24.4b, if an advice giver deliberately stands behind the player when he or she starts to take a stance, if the player asks or authorizes the advice giver to do this, he or she gets the general penalty. So in other words, the first paragraph is the player is only going to get the penalty if he asks or authorizes the coach to stand behind him. Second paragraph, if the player did not ask or authorize the advice giver to stand in that location, meaning behind the player, but knows that this is not allowed, does not take reasonable actions to stop it, the player then gets the general penalty. So in the high school coach situation, 3 things have to happen before the player is going to get a penalty. The first is the player must know that the coach is standing there. Secondly, the player must know that this is not allowed under the rules. And thirdly, the player must then fail to take some actions by saying, coach, you can't stand there. So in a typical situation, if that player in a high school event or a college is very focused, doesn't see their coach standing there, there's never going to be a penalty. One of the other questions that comes up in high school events is, is the coach treated as part of the side? And the question often comes up, a player hits his ball into tall grass, the coach wants to go up there and search for the ball, and he knows that the 3 minutes doesn't start until the player gets there. What can the coach go up there, and does that trigger the 3 minutes? And the answer is no, it does not trigger the 3 minutes. The coach is treated just like anyone else. He can like spectator. He can search for it, and it's only when the player gets there or with reasonable effort should have gotten there that the 3 minute time period starts.
Is normally an outside influence.
Yes.
There's a question online, certainly emanating from east of here, but the person writes, in Michigan and Indiana high school, regional, and state tournaments, once the ball is on the green, advice must cease. Local rule. I'm reading verbatim.
So it sounds like in either Michigan or Indiana, they adopt a local rule that says an advice giver cannot give advice to the player once his ball is on there. So in other words, the coach could not say the putt breaks from left to right or right to left. That's what apparently the local rule in Indiana or
Which is part of age too.
Which is
not
part
a
of-
local rule.
I know for you in Wisconsin, that is not the rule. The coach is not allowed on the green, but they can give the player advice by standing off the green. Gary, you have a question? Or?
Did you hear any more on that, Bill?
Well, here's what is on the WIA website. When you started talking, I went to look. It says 2 coaches are allowed to coach during competition, which doesn't really tend to the advice, but the designated coach may give rules options to their own player anytime and rules options to other competitors only when asked by that competitor. The designated coach is only allowed on the greens to manage the flag stick and allowed to rake bunkers after a player has completed their shot from the bunker. The person acting as a coach must be under contract with the school as a golf coach. Players may accept verbal and hand signal advice from their school's designated coach only. Notes, tees, and other items left behind by teammates and or coaches are prohibited. Coaches cannot align players while the player is at address, nor delay pace of play in any way. That works at the, never mind. The penalty for violating the flag stick rule is revocation of allowing the coach on the green. And that's how they address that topic.
So the point of prohibiting the coach from going on the putting green makes sense, but what they've effectively done is cut out an exception to say if the coach is there for purposes of managing the play, meaning i.e. speeding them up, they want the coach to be able to pull out the flag stick, let the player putt, and then put the flag stick back in.
But in theory, the flag stick rule covers that. Does it not? Because it says the flag stick may be attended by anyone.
Oh, yes, but if you have a rule that prohibits the advice giver from going on the putting green, you would then have to cut out an exception. Otherwise, if the advice giver goes on there to pull out the flag stick, he has violated the advice giver rule. All right, any questions on 24?
And in team competition, you've got 4 advice givers sitting on a bench directly behind the tee where their 4 players are teeing off. Is that not a violation?
Are you talking about a violation of 10.2B4 with the quote caddy / advice keeper lining them up? The answer is you have to have all 3 of those things. You have to have the player know that the advice giver is there. B, he must know that the rules prohibit it, and C, he must fail to take reasonable actions to have them move. So if it is truly a bench that is right behind it, and the player goes to put his club down, and when he's taking his backswing, he almost hits his coach in the face, he kind of knows he's there, I think, you know, and then does the player know that he's not allowed to do that? I mean, that's questionable. I mean, if you're the rules official, you would have to inquire, did you know that that was a violation? If he says, oh yeah, of course, I knew this violation, then he's going to get a penalty if he doesn't tell the guy to move.
All of that is really spelled out in clarifications, not in the rule itself, though. So you'd have to go to the new clarifications. You won't find it in the book.
Maybe since somebody, do I have that here? One of the people in this room, although he or she is not in the room right as we speak, asked me a question 2 weeks ago. I answered their question by saying the answer is you can find the answer in clarification such and such. And then the person emailed me back and said, what is a clarification? So it dawned on me that perhaps there are others other than this one person who does not know what a clarification is. So let me take 2 minutes to go over that. The WSGA issues the rules. Then it issues interpretations and puts them in the book or puts them on the app. Then 2019 is about to start, and the WSGA says, well, there are a few issues that we need to, depending on how you want to spell it out, either we want to change or we want to modify or we want to clarify. And then the WSGA issues what are called clarifications. And they issue them and they put them on the website. For those of you that have apps, they are also on the app. So if you click on Rule 16.1 or whatever you want, you will see a little blue, it's kind of an oval that says clarifications. And then you click on that. So if you went to the website to find out what the clarifications are, there are 10 pages of clarifications, and they are organized in 3 different sections, so you got to read the 3 different sections. One is under the rules. So if you say, is there one under rule number 1.3c? Yes, there's the clarification. Then they're also under the definitions. So then you have to look under the definitions. There's one on club lengths, and you read that. And then there's another one for committee procedures. So anytime you want to know what a rule says, there are multiple places that you have to look. You have to look at the rule itself. Then you have to look at the definitions that are under the rules. Then you have to look for the interpretations that are under the sub-rule that you're looking under. Then you have to look under the interpretations that are under the main rule that you're looking under. Then you have to look under the clarifications, which can be in 3 different locations. Then you have to look under the terms of the competition, also known as the hard card. And then you have to look at the notice to players. The last 2 of those things have nothing to do with the national exam, but the first ones all do. And so when you take the national exam, I believe you're going to have to know these clarifications, and you're going to need to print them out, because when you take the national exam, you can't use anything electronic. So you have to print out this 10-page sheet, take your official guide and your rule book.
I think they do. Yeah.
Okay. John has said they actually hand them out at the rules meeting, so you've saved yourself the printing costs of 10 pages, but you got to know them. Want to take a break?
We'll take a small break for 10 minutes and then resume with the questions.
10:20.
10:20.
If you don't mark your spot.
Okay, we're gonna get going with the questions. We're certainly gonna be done quite early, and because of that, for the two of you, if not more, that are staying to take the exam, hopefully we could start early. But before we get going, I just want to say something. First of all, I want to thank you all for your interest. John kind of said something when we began that I kind of chuckled at. Our biggest audience comes with the probably 4 least exciting rules. But it does show you the involvement of all the people in golf in Wisconsin. And we couldn't do what we do without all of your help. So thank you very much. And if I could only impress upon all of you how lucky we are to have John Morissette and Dan Stolper. You know, if you think of the population of the world and people that know rules, these are 2 of the best on the whole planet as far as understanding this material. And think of the statement that that makes, considering, what did we say last year? The amount of people are like 7 billion or more in the world. And to be one of the top 10 in the world is remarkable. So that's who's been teaching you these last 6 sessions.
And Bill, you're remembering Mr. One.
Well, no. I come along for the ride. But we'll start with the last questions that hopefully will help you get ready for the test. I think Thomas has them up on the screen for the online people. So we'll start question 56 pertaining to Rule 21. In a handicap Stableford competition against a fixed target score of par, a player returns his scorecard to the committee with a score of 6 at the 9th hole when his score for the hole is actually 7. Because the player inadvertently forgot to count the second shot that only went 10 feet. The 9th hole is a par 4 at which the player receives a handicap stroke. What is the ruling? Well, if you know the rules, this is a scorecard error. It has nothing to do with any penalty strokes, and the player returned a score lower than what he actually made. And it's pretty simple. Whether you like Culver's or not, we're going to be sending you to Dairy Queen. So that is a pretty simple question that you don't want to get caught up in a lot of the things. The player simply returned a scorecard with a score lower than what he actually made. Moving on to question 57, which pertains to Rule 22. In foursomes stroke play with side AB, player A, whose turn it is to play, plays a ball from outside the teeing area. His partner, player B, then makes the side's next stroke from within the teeing area. What is the penalty, And which player, A or B, makes the next stroke? Well, if A was the player whose turn it was to play, plays from outside the teeing ground, that's a 2-stroke penalty for playing from outside the teeing ground. That's pretty simple. What should happen then? Player A, because that stroke didn't count, player A should then make the side's next stroke. Well, player B played, so the side played out of order, which is another 2-stroke penalty. So, going through the answers, there is no penalty if A puts the ball into play from the teeing area. That's not true. The side gets the general penalty, and player A must play a ball from within the teeing area. C, there is a total penalty of 4 strokes, and player A must play from within the teeing area. D, the side is disqualified. Well, if we had gotten to the next teeing area, D would be the correct answer. But the side gets 2 penalty strokes for playing from outside the teeing area, 2 penalty strokes for playing out of order in foursomes, and who is supposed to play? They have to correct the error of playing out of order. A must play from within the teeing area, so they get 4 penalty strokes, and A will be hitting the 5th stroke, and none of those strokes, B's stroke doesn't count, A's stroke from playing from outside the teeing area doesn't count, just the 4 penalty strokes, and the next stroke would be player A making the 5th stroke for the side. So the answer is C for question 57. Question 58, and I can assure you, you'll see something like this, John.
Different than if we play a long ball, because in a long ball you ignore the strokes taken with the long ball.
Yeah, and you also ignore the strokes played out of order in a foursomes.
But you penalize, but there's no additional penalty for playing in the wrong order with the wrong ball, is there? Or is this just strictly with foursomes that the wrong order always counts?
Well, I think in terms of the wrong ball, you have to correct the error. Playing from outside the teeing area, you have to correct the error. And then playing in the wrong order, you have to correct the error. So, and none of the original strokes count or any subsequent strokes. And then with regard to foursomes, you do have to play in the correct order. Or if you had played a wrong ball, you have to correct the error by playing the original ball or playing under the rules. And the outside the teeing area, you in stroke play, you'd have to correct the error as well by playing a ball from within the teeing area. So all 3 of those would require correcting.
Right, but would the same result if let's say A teed off from outside the team and then B hit the next stroke, and then they realize that they should have played from the team area?
The answer would be the same because none of those strokes would count.
Right, but you ended up with 4 penalty strokes.
In either case.
But typically, don't you ignore the penalty strokes after let's say it's a wrong ball, but if you incurred another penalty stroke after you played a wrong ball, you would ignore that penalty stroke.
Solely for playing that ball.
Yeah, and I think there's a difference. Maybe we're talking about 2 different situations where, let's say, John, that Bill and I are partners. It is Bill's turn to tee off. He tees off, but outside the teeing area. And then we get up to the fairway, and I hit that shot. And then we realize, then someone says, "Bill, you played from outside the teeing area." You're right. In that case, there's no issue there because that's a continuation of that original playing from outside the teeing area. But if we, after the tee shot, someone says, well, Bill, you played from outside the teeing area, and I mistakenly say, okay, Bill, I need to correct that mistake. I'm going to play from within the teeing area. So we're trying to correct it, but the wrong person is correcting it. That's different than in the fairway when I'm just continuing to play, if that makes sense.
Basically just on the team area.
Yeah, well, it could be a wrong ball situation. So let's say Bill and I are partners. We tee off, and then I find a ball I think is ours. I play it. It turns out to be a wrong ball. So we know right then and there, stroke play, 2 strokes. We have to correct the mistake. But then let's say when we go back and correct the mistake, that instead of my playing it, Bill plays it. Then it'd be the same as that question. Then we've played out of order.
So if you make a mistake, you always have to have the same person that made the mistake go back and correct the mistake.
If the stroke didn't count.
Yeah.
Right. Because you're alternating actual strokes
Compared to
that
if you
count.
were to go into a penalty area, then it would be the other player's turn.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, one of the things that, Randy, you've been at our paterfilius, or our father-son, we always tell them, you're alternating actual strokes taken, that penalty strokes don't affect the order of play. And then in a lengthy manner, apparently, we go through a few examples. But we are hoping to avoid problems. Moving on to question 58, in a mixed foursome competition in which men play from the teeing areas defined by the back tee markers and the women play from the teeing areas defined by the forward tee markers, a man hits his tee shot out of bounds. How must the side proceed? Well, we know the player has to proceed under, or the side has to proceed under stroke and distance. So the side is required to play from where the previous stroke was made. And the man hit it out of bounds, so whose turn is it to play? The woman's. And where did the man play the stroke? From the back teeing area. So the correct answer, I don't even have to look at any of the answers. If you just think this through logically, the woman has to play under stroke and distance from where the previous stroke was made. That's from anywhere within the teeing area defined by the back tees. And the penalty would be 1 stroke. So the answer should be the women. C is the correct answer. The women, the man's partner, plays from the teeing area defined by the back tee markers under penalty of stroke and distance. It's really, if you just logically think it out, the answer is fairly simple in that regard. And I'll tell you, while you're taking an exam, I would encourage you, and I learned this from a past rules chairman of the WSGA, whether it's the open book or the closed book, and I'd be specifically talking about the open book part, the second part, try to answer the question without ever delving into the resources. Think it through logically, and then if you don't know, then start the proverbial hunt for the answer. But a lot of times, if you know the rules, you'll be able to answer even the open book part without opening the book. I mean, that's sort of the goal. You know, you wonder why they give you a timed thing for 100 questions. When you're out on a course, and I guarantee you, if you've worked tournaments, which you have, it's not always exciting. 99% of it is not exciting. But I'm telling you, when the 1% comes up and a player comes up to you and says, I need your help, he doesn't want you digging through the book, trying to find the answer. You know, it's okay to dig through the book if you can flip right to the answer and show them. Having the book, knowing the answer, where it is in the book, actually, to me, shows a sign of strength. You knew where it was, you can prove it to them in writing, and the book itself is the answer. But do try to answer off the top of your head before you ever dive into the book. Moving on to question 59 pertaining to Rule 22, in foursome stroke play, which of the following is correct regarding the order of play? So here's a case where you're going to have to read all of the answers and answer them correct or not correct, true or false, essentially. Answer A, if player A plays when it is B's turn to play, the stroke counts and the side is penalized 2 strokes. Well, that's a true statement as far as the penalty statement, but the stroke does not count. That's what makes that answer not correct. Answer B, if player A purposely misses the ball with his stroke, it is now player B's turn to play. Well, a stroke is intent. If I intend to miss, I didn't make a stroke. So it would still be player A's ball is what that interpretation says. That interpretation that answers that question is interpretation 22.3/3, talking about a player purposely missing a stroke. Answer C, when starting the hole, player A tees off from outside the teeing area. It is now player B's turn to play. Well, did the stroke count? No. So is it still player A's turn to play? Yes. So that makes that not a correct statement. And lastly, and if you answer the first 3 as not being correct, and you're looking for a correct answer, you better hope your answer to D is that it's correct, or you're going to go right back to the beginning. But if player A accidentally touches their ball and it moves, it is still his turn to play. That's a ball at rest move by the player's partner or anyone part of their side, and they would simply replace it at a 1-stroke penalty, and it would still be their turn to play. So answer D is the correct answer. And that is another one that should kind of be a chip shot, so to say. Question 60, moving on to Rule 23. In 4-ball stroke play, players A and B are partners. On the 13th hole, player B accidentally chips player A's ball from just short of the putting green. Player A sees how the ball rolls to the hole. Player A realizes the mistake before playing player B's ball, which would again be another wrong ball. What is the ruling? Well, Dan kind of talked about this at the end of Rule 23. If I play a wrong ball, even though it might help the player's partner, there is no penalty on the partner, just the player. What is it? He played a wrong ball. What's the penalty for playing a wrong ball? 2 strokes, and you're required to correct the error. But it is stroke play, so we don't have to worry about that player being out of the hole. So let's go through the answers. Answer A, player B, the player who hit the wrong ball, is penalized 2 strokes. Well, that's true. Player A gets no penalty and must place a ball on the spot from which player B hit player A's ball. Player B may then play his own ball. Is all of that correct? Yeah. So I personally, if I were taking this test, I would write correct or true. And we'll move on. Player B is penalized 2 strokes. That's true. Player A gets 2 penalty strokes since he was helped. Well, as we talked about before, that's refuted under Rule 23, and we know that's not the case. So you can cross out B. C, player B is disqualified from the hole. If this were match play, that'd be a true statement. But it's not match play, it's stroke play. So we know C is not the correct answer. You don't even need to read on, because B simply played a wrong ball, and the rules allow you to correct playing a wrong ball. So you're not disqualified until you tee off on the next teeing area or play from the next teeing area. So that's not correct. Answer D, player B is disqualified from the hole. I don't need to read any further. I know that that's not correct. So the correct answer is definitely A, that player B is penalized 2 strokes. Player A gets no penalty. And just like the regular wrong ball ruling, if it were singles, he places a ball on the spot from which player B played player A's ball. Player B would then be allowed to play his own ball as it lie and play on. So any questions on that? Moving on, question 61. In 4-ball stroke play, the 1-ball condition is in effect, and a player accidentally switches to a different brand of ball during play of the 5th hole, a breach of the condition. The mistake is discovered during play of the 8th hole. So we know that the player has breached the condition on the 5th hole, the 6th hole, the 7th hole, and the 8th hole. So the players breach this condition on 4 holes. That's really important to know. The player completes play of the 8th hole and then switches back to the correct brand for the remainder of the round. What is the penalty? Well, unlike the maximum penalty for having too many clubs, which is capped at an adjustment penalty of 2 holes in match play or 4 strokes in stroke play at the first holes where they appear. In this case, if you go read the condition, and the only way to answer this is to go into the official guide, go into the committee procedures section, go into the model local rules, find the 1-ball condition, model local rule, and then read the penalty statement. And it states that at each hole for which a breach took place, there's a penalty of 2 strokes. So we're going to go through and find the answer. It also only applies to the player. Unlike the 14 club rule, the player, his partner, doesn't receive any benefit for the fact that he's playing a ball. They can share balls already in terms of, I can lend my partner a golf ball to play, provided it meets the 1-ball condition, but I can't share clubs, provided we have more than 14. So, reading through the answers, he is penalized 2 strokes on the 5th and 6th holes. His partner receives no penalty. Well, that might be the penalty if it was a 14 club thing, but it's not. He is penalized 2 strokes on holes 5 through 8 for a total of 8 penalty strokes. His partner receives no penalty. That's true. Answer C, both he and his partner are penalized 2 strokes. We know that the partner's not penalized, so that's not the answer. And D, both he and his partner are penalized. We know we can eliminate that. So the correct answer is B, the player himself or herself is penalized 2 strokes at each hole for which there is a breach of the condition. If I started out the first hole and in the middle of the hole switched balls, and I was started out with a Titleist, and in the middle of the first hole I switched to a TaylorMade with the 1-ball condition in effect, and I played that TaylorMade for the rest of the round, how many penalty strokes would I get? 36. If I was trying to qualify for a WSGA championship, would I have a chance? Probably not. Be quite a round if he did.
What would be the reason why this would be more severe?
I think part of it is that, with the 14 club rule, you're not necessarily taking advantage of that on every hole. You're not, for example, if you start the round with 14 clubs or with 15 clubs, you may only use 10 clubs during the round, and you haven't necessarily, benefited a a tremendous amount by that extra club. But when you're in breach of, say, the one ball rule, that is something that you are using that on every hole, every stroke.
Yeah, but by that logic, if you did it on the first hole, you should only get 2-stroke penalty because for 17 holes, you played the same ball.
Yeah, but then you're playing a ball that you shouldn't have.
Different than what you started
But on
with.
17 holes, you have played the same ball.
Well, no, but you're still actively breaching that.
I understand
rule.
I think you should.
You'd be
What do you mean,
surprised. It's my understanding when we go to our national meetings that other than the PGA Tour and all related tours for the LPGA and the PGA and USGA championships, most associations do not use the one ball condition any longer. Why? Very simple example, and we've had this happen in our events. If I bought a sleeve of Titleist Pro V1Xs in 2018 in December, and Titleist came out in December of 2018, and Titleist came out with a new version of the Pro V1 and Pro V1X for January of 19. And I tee off with a ball that I got in December, and I switched in the middle of the round to a Titleist Pro V1X that I purchased that is the new version. Those are listed as separate listings on the list of conforming golf balls, and believe it or not, while I think I might be playing the same Titleist Pro V1X, I am playing two different listing of balls under the one ball condition, and that seems to a fair-minded person to be not reasonable. And that's the reason why we don't. Most people think of it in the old days like Balata balls and Sirlin balls. That's not the case. The way it's worded is, you must play a ball listed, as a single entry on the list of conforming balls. Well, believe it or not, this came up last year. Is a yellow Pro V1X a different listing than a white Pro V1X? Yeah, so they're different balls. You might think you're playing the same ball, but you're playing a different listing. Again, it's splitting hairs, but it's the way that the rule is worded, or in this case, the way the condition is listed. All the USGA qualifiers require the one ball condition. They've even gone so far as distance measuring devices are now allowed in qualifying events for the US Open, Senior Open, Women's Open, and Senior Women's Open, but not in the actual championship. And that's because of the tours dictate. But in terms of the local qualifying or the sectional qualifying in the US Open, distance measuring devices are now allowed even in open championships for the USGA, but not the championship itself. Heresy. We'll get to a full-blown acceptance here in a year or two. The floodgates have opened. Question 62 pertaining to Rule 23. In 4-ball match play, player A has a putt of 10 feet. His partner, player B, has a putt of 4 feet on the same line. Their opponents concede player B's putt, the 4-footer. Player B then putts out anyway. What is the ruling? Well, we just went over this. If that act would help his partner, that player's score counts. Why? Because any penalty can't, if they conceded the putt, for that player, the hole's over at that moment. All that player is doing is practicing between play of 2 holes. So his score for the hole can count. His partner, who still has yet to hole out, his score can no longer count under that rule. So we're going to go try to find that answer. There's no penalty. Well, we know that's not true. Answer B, player A is disqualified from the hole. That's the player that had the 10-foot putt. Well, so far that's true. And player B gets no penalty. That's true. The hole was over for him. And his score counts for the side. Yeah, that's the answer. Answer B. But I like to keep reading just to make sure player B is disqualified from the hole. I know that's not the case because his score counts for the hole. It says it right in the rule. Player A gets no penalty. That's not the case. And side A or B lose the hole. That's not the case either. Why would B lose the hole when he has a score that can actually count for the hole? Even though he's the one that breached the rule, when did the breach take place? The hole was over. Once the putt was conceded, it's hard to be penalized for a hole when you've completed play of the hole. And finally, question 63, in a team competition, who of the following may a player obtain advice from while the player is playing his or her round? So let's go through these. Could I get advice from a member of my team while playing in a different group on the course during the round? No, says it right in the rule. B, could I get advice from a member of my team playing in the same group without any local rules in effect? No. Why does it say without any local rules in effect? Because under the advice model local rules, in a team competition where there is no individual competition as well, the competition is strictly team, I could adopt a local rule, model local rule, where if team A has members A and B and team Z has members C and D, you could pair them together and with a model local rule, if it's just a team competition, allow A and B and C and D to give each other advice as members of a team, but they're not partners. It would be through a model local rule. So B is not the correct answer. C, the team's advice giver. Well, the advice giver is appropriately named. He's allowed to give advice. Who is another player on the team while he or she, the advice giver, is playing his or her round. Right in Rule 24.4b, it says, if the advice giver is playing his or her round, they are nothing more than another member of the team, and you could not give or share advice. So that's not correct. And the team's advice giver, who is another player on the team, when he or she, the advice giver, is not playing his or her round during the competition. That's the correct answer and makes sense. I mean, that's the only time they could give advice. So hopefully, you know, some of these questions have helped you. If there's one thing I know, whether you've taken part in these review sessions in person or online, I know there's several people in this room, myself, Phil Paletti, others whose scores have gone up through the years as a result of these sessions. I mean, I know that for a fact. So hopefully you found these sessions helpful and beneficial. You can also go online on YouTube, and if you are truly bored for 24 hours, it'll only take you 24 hours of listening to audio on YouTube to go through these. But frankly, even someone myself or John or Dan, who's been doing this for years and interested in the rules, sitting, no offense, John, but sitting through a USGA PGA workshop for 9 hours a day for 3 days, and then taking a 100-question test, it's not the most exciting thing in the world. But it's
This is the most
this
exciting.
is.
Well, I'm curious, how many people here are going to either the Milwaukee class or another PGA USGA? Oh, wow. Oh,
That's great.
That's great. That's fantastic.
That's great. You know, the one thing I will tell you with rules education, every day is a new learning experience. You'll learn something, whether it's little tidbits here and there or things in general or understanding concepts. That's why we have John and Dan here to help explain it to you and to me. This is a great avenue to learn. Going through a USGA PGA workshop will also help you learn. For those of you going to Milwaukee, David Stabler is going to be the USGA instructor, and there's few better than him. Maybe John Morissette. And then the PGA instructor is Jesse Barge, if I'm not mistaken, who's a terrific PGA instructor. So there'll be two great instructors. I believe that seminar takes place March 23rd through 27th, 20th through the 23rd. Yep, Friday, March 20th through Monday, March 23rd. And obviously there's exams elsewhere. I do want to say one last thing. Now that the WSGA has taken over all the WWSGA events, there's going to be a number of days, and one of them is the day of the state high school tournament. To give you an example, the state high school boys tournament is Monday and Tuesday, June 15th and 16th. That same day will be the second round of the WSGA Women's Senior Amateur at Lake Arrowhead. It'll also be a double shift senior tour event at Ozaki. So while we might have 10 officials that want to work the state high school tournament, we also need 4 to 6 officials at Lake Arrowhead, and we're also going to need 4 to 6 officials at Ozaki. So we encourage all of you to keep dates like that in mind, knowing that there's going to be a number of days like that throughout the year, and we're going to send out an email reminder, encouraging, of course, your involvement. But seriously, we can't thank you all enough for participating in this and for all your help. While it may not be the most exciting thing when you're out on a course, believe me, when the moment happens and your help is needed, that player is appreciative, I'll guarantee it. And our players do know and are very cognizant of the fact that we have great officials. I get a report every year from the USGA of a survey of their players in their championship qualifying events, and I can tell you our officials rank 92% or higher, which is interesting because that is the number at which you would hope 90% or higher. And that's great to know. That probably makes John feel good that his efforts are teaching are well spent, and same with Dan. And it makes me feel great because our players are given the best avenue for competitions. And to Gene and Peg, thank you very much for taking part in this. And I truly look forward to other women starting to learn. You know, it's not the most exciting subject. It really isn't. But I'm telling you, it's the foundation of the whole game. And without it, golf would be crazy. And so we move forward. What do you think?
Kramer.
In any event,